You can see it almost everywhere now. A dinner table, a meeting room, a family gathering, a group of friends sitting together. Everyone is present, everyone is connected, everyone is reachable. And yet, something feels strangely incomplete. Nobody left the room. Nobody disappeared. Nobody stopped participating. The conversation continues. The messages continue. The interaction continues. Everything appears active. That's what makes the pattern difficult to recognize. Because the modern version of absence rarely looks like absence. It looks like participation. A glance toward a screen. A thought already moving toward the next task. A notification entering the conversation. A moment divided before it fully begins. The body remains here. Attention starts traveling somewhere else. Not permanently, just long enough for something important to disappear. The strange part is that this happens everywhere at the same time. Work, relationships, families, friendships, conversations. The connection survived. Presence became fragmented. And once presence becomes fragmented, people begin experiencing each other differently. Not because anyone stopped caring, because attention stopped arriving all at once. We became reachable from almost anywhere. Somehow, that did not guarantee that anyone was actually here. I started noticing a strange contradiction. There are people I can contact instantly, people I interact with every day, people who respond, react, reply, update. The signal never stops. And yet some interactions feel strangely unfinished. Not because anyone ignored me, because something else was always present too. Another screen, another task, another interruption. The conversation happened. The moment never fully arrived. That's what made the feeling difficult to explain. Nothing looked broken. Everything simply felt divided. There was a time when presence was easier to recognize because it required effort. Distance created friction. A conversation required planning. A phone call interrupted the day. A visit required travel. Attention had a cost. Time had a cost. Presence had a cost. The limitation was frustrating, but it created something valuable. You knew when somebody arrived because arrival required a decision. They chose the moment. They chose the conversation. They chose to direct their attention toward one place instead of another. The signal was weaker. The commitment was stronger. Today, the opposite is true. The signal became effortless. Presence did not. A message can travel across the world in seconds. A conversation can begin instantly. Access expanded beyond anything previous generations could imagine. The barrier disappeared. The cost of contact approached zero. And that's exactly where something started to change. When access became unlimited, attention became scarce. The ability to reach someone stopped being meaningful because everyone could do it. The signal multiplied. The value shifted somewhere else, not toward information, toward focus, toward uninterrupted attention, toward the increasingly rare experience of somebody occupying the same moment without competing priorities pulling them away. The modern world became very good at delivering contact. It became much less effective at protecting presence. I sometimes think about how different a phone call used to feel. Not because the technology mattered, because the interruption mattered. Someone stopped what they were doing. Someone committed a piece of their day to a single conversation. That decision created weight. Today, communication became easier than ever. Yet many interactions feel lighter, faster, more fragmented. The connection became more efficient. The commitment became harder to notice. The modern world solved a problem that existed for centuries: access. Information became available instantly. Communication became immediate. Distance stopped behaving like distance. Almost anyone could be reached at almost any moment. From a technological perspective, the problem was solved. From a human perspective, a different problem quietly appeared. Access and attention are not the same thing. Access determines whether a connection is possible. Attention determines whether the connection is experienced. The first became abundant. The second remained limited. Every message competes with another message. Every conversation competes with another task. Every moment competes with another destination. The signal arrives immediately. Attention arrives selectively. That's why modern communication often feels strange. Contact happens constantly. Presence feels inconsistent. The system measures delivery. Humans experience attention. Those are different metrics. A message can be delivered perfectly and still feel empty. A conversation can occur successfully and still feel unfinished. Information reached its destination. Attention didn't. The distinction sounds small until you notice how much of modern life depends on it. Relationships depend on it. Collaboration depends on it. Trust depends on it. Understanding depends on it. The infrastructure optimized transmission. It never solved competition. And attention now exists inside the most competitive environment in human history. I notice it in myself sometimes. A message arrives. I read it. I intend to answer. Then something else appears. Another notification, another thought, another task. Nothing dramatic happens. The conversation simply moves further down the list. The strange part is that this now feels normal. Not because attention became larger, because everything around it became louder. The connection remains available. The attention keeps negotiating where to go next. For most of human history, a moment was usually experienced in one place at a time. A conversation competed with very little. A meal remained a meal. A meeting remained a meeting. An evening remained an evening. The moment had boundaries. The modern environment changed those boundaries completely. Today, a single moment can contain multiple competing destinations. A conversation shares space with notifications. A meeting shares space with messages. A meal shares space with headlines, recommendations, updates, reminders, alerts, and unfinished tasks waiting somewhere else. The body remains in one location. Attention becomes distributed across many. Nothing appears broken because the division happens gradually. Small fragments leave the moment one at a time. A quick glance, a brief interruption, a passing thought, a notification that lasts 2 seconds. None of these events feel significant individually. Together, they create something larger. The moment loses its unity. Not enough to collapse, just enough to weaken. That's why many experiences now feel less substantial than they once did. Not because they disappeared, because they became crowded. Attention rarely leaves all at once. It leaves in fragments. And the human mind experiences those fragments as absence long before it learns how to describe them. The room remains full. The conversation remains active. The people remain present. Something essential becomes increasingly difficult to hold together. A shared moment. I started noticing how often interruptions now arrive before a thought fully finishes. Sometimes the interruption lasts only a few seconds. Sometimes it feels harmless. But when enough of them accumulate, the experience changes. The conversation continues. The task continues. The evening continues. Yet something feels thinner, less complete, as if every moment is quietly sharing space with several others at the same time. The fragmentation of attention did not happen by accident. It emerged from an environment where attention became one of the most valuable resources available. Every platform competes for it. Every notification requests it. Every recommendation attempts to redirect it. Every interface is designed around the same objective: not your time, your next moment of attention. The distinction matters because time moves continuously. Attention moves selectively. You can spend an hour somewhere without fully experiencing it. You can spend 10 seconds paying attention and remember them for years. Systems understand this. Attention determines what enters memory, what shapes behavior, what influences decisions, what creates value. That's why modern environments compete so aggressively for it. Not because attention is infinite, because it isn't. Every signal entering your awareness is competing against another signal trying to do exactly the same thing. The result is not necessarily distraction. The result is fragmentation. Attention rarely settles in one place for long. Something new is always available. Something more urgent is always appearing. Something else is always asking for a share of the moment. The competition never ends because the resource never expands. Human attention remains limited. The number of systems competing for it continues to grow. And every new competitor increases pressure on the same finite resource. Eventually, the environment stops feeling interrupted. The interruptions become the environment itself. I think that's why silence feels different now. Not relaxing, unusual. A moment without alerts, updates, reminders, recommendations, or incoming signals almost feels empty. Which is strange when you think about it. Silence didn't become rare because it disappeared. Silence became rare because competition moved into every available space around it. One of the most significant changes in modern life is that partial attention no longer feels unusual. It feels normal. A conversation continues while something else happens in the background. A meeting shares space with incoming messages. A meal competes with notifications. A relationship competes with unfinished tasks. Nobody consciously decides to divide the moment. The division simply becomes expected. Over time, people stop noticing it. The interruption no longer feels like an interruption because it appears before attention fully settles. That's what makes the shift so difficult to recognize. The environment changes first. Expectations change second. Behavior follows afterward. Eventually, everyone adapts to the same conditions. Conversations become shorter. Responses become faster. Focus becomes more temporary. Presence becomes more flexible. The system rewards responsiveness. Humans often interpret responsiveness as engagement. Those are not always the same thing. Someone can respond instantly and still be mentally elsewhere. Someone can remain available without being fully present. The distinction becomes increasingly important as attention becomes more fragmented. Because humans experience presence differently than systems measure activity, activity can be divided endlessly. Presence cannot. Presence requires concentration. Presence requires exclusion. Presence requires choosing one moment over competing alternatives. The more alternatives appear, the more valuable that choice becomes. Yet the environment constantly encourages the opposite behavior. Stay connected, stay updated, stay available, stay responsive, stay ready for the next signal. Eventually, divided attention stops feeling temporary. It becomes a permanent operating condition. I think this is why certain moments now feel surprisingly memorable. Not because something extraordinary happened, because nothing interrupted it. A conversation without notifications, a meal without screens, an evening without constant switching. The experience feels different almost immediately, not because attention increased, because divisions stopped. For a brief period of time, the moment belonged entirely to itself. For most of human history, attention competed against very little. The room contained the room. The conversation contained the conversation. The meal contained the meal. There were distractions, of course. Human attention has always wandered. But the environment itself was relatively quiet. The modern environment is different. Every moment now exists inside an infrastructure designed to generate additional moments. A conversation competes with updates. A task competes with recommendations. A meal competes with headlines. A thought competes with another thought that arrives through a screen. The room no longer contains only the room. It contains countless invitations to leave it. That's an important distinction because attention behaves differently when alternatives become visible. The human mind naturally evaluates options. The more options available, the more difficult it becomes to remain fully committed to one. Modern systems continuously increase the number of available alternatives. Another article, another message, another notification, another update, another destination for awareness. None of these signals are individually powerful enough to dominate attention. They don't need to be. Their strength comes from accumulation. One signal becomes 10, 10 become 100. Eventually, the environment itself starts encouraging movement. Attention learns to keep scanning, keep checking, keep preparing for the next signal. The habit becomes automatic. Presence becomes temporary. Awareness becomes mobile. The moment remains available. Attention spends less time staying inside it. That's why so many experiences now feel incomplete even when nothing interrupts them directly. The possibility of interruption becomes part of the experience itself. The room fills with signals long before any of them are used. Sometimes I notice it before anything actually happens. The phone doesn't ring. No notification appears. Nothing arrives. And yet, part of my attention already feels prepared for something else. Waiting, anticipating, scanning. That's the strange thing about modern environments. The interruption doesn't always need to happen. The expectation of interruption often accomplishes the same result. For a long time, human presence was defined by arrival. Someone entered the room. Someone sat down at the table. Someone joined the conversation. The transition was visible. You could feel the difference between before and after. The person was either there or they weren't. Arrival created a boundary. It created a moment where attention moved from one place to another. Modern communication changed that experience completely. Today, people rarely arrive. They connect. They remain available, reachable, active, present in a technical sense. But technical presence and human presence are not the same thing. A person can enter a conversation without leaving the previous one. They can join a meeting while thinking about another task. They can sit across from someone while continuing a dozen invisible interactions elsewhere. The body arrives. Attention negotiates. That's the difference. Arrival used to require commitment. Connection requires access. One asks you to enter the moment. The other allows you to remain connected to many moments simultaneously. The system considers this an improvement. In many ways, it is. Communication became faster. Coordination became easier. Information became more accessible. But something else quietly disappeared. The feeling that another person had fully crossed the threshold into the same experience. The feeling that they had actually arrived. Modern life is full of contact, full of activity, full of communication. What it often lacks is transition. The visible movement from elsewhere to here. From distraction to focus. From availability to presence. Arrival became difficult to notice because the signal never truly leaves. And when the signal never leaves, neither does the possibility of being somewhere else. I think that's why certain conversations feel different almost immediately. You don't notice what was said first. You notice what isn't competing with it. No divided attention, no visible urgency, no sense that the other person is preparing to leave before the moment has even started. For a few minutes, they seem entirely here. It's a surprisingly powerful feeling. Mostly because it has become surprisingly uncommon. The disappearance of full presence is not the result of a single decision. It is the natural outcome of an environment built around continuous engagement. Every modern system faces the same challenge. Attention is limited. Competition is not. The objective is not necessarily to keep you away from other people. The objective is to keep you connected to the system. The distinction matters. A platform benefits when attention returns frequently. A service benefits when awareness remains available. An interface benefits when engagement continues. None of these systems need complete control of attention. They only need a share of it. That's what makes the environment so effective. Every system asks for a small fragment, a glance, a tap, a response, a check, a moment. Individually, the requests seem insignificant. Collectively, they reshape the structure of attention itself. Full presence becomes increasingly difficult because attention is continuously redistributed before it fully settles. The environment does not require absence. It benefits from partial presence. Partial presence keeps attention mobile. Mobile attention generates activity. Activity generates data. Data generates optimization. Optimization creates even more opportunities to compete for attention. The cycle reinforces itself. Nobody needs to force distraction. The environment simply rewards interruption. That's why modern life often feels busy without feeling meaningful. Attention keeps moving. Movement becomes mistaken for engagement. Engagement becomes mistaken for connection. And somewhere inside that process, presence becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Not because anyone took it away, because too many systems learned how valuable a fraction of it could be. I think that's why the most valuable moments now feel strangely resistant to optimization. A long conversation, a shared meal, a quiet evening with someone who has nowhere else to be. There is very little efficiency in those moments, very little measurable activity, very little to track. Yet they often feel more substantial than hours spent moving between signals. It's almost as if presence creates value that systems can experience but never fully measure. People often describe modern life as a shortage of time. There never seems to be enough of it. More tasks, more information, more responsibilities, more things competing for the same 24 hours. But time was never the resource that changed. Everyone still receives the same amount each day. What changed was attention. Time continues moving whether you notice it or not. Attention decides what gets experienced while it moves. That's why 2 hours can feel completely different depending on how attention is used. A fragmented hour often disappears. A fully experienced hour can remain memorable for years. The difference is not duration. The difference is concentration. Modern systems compete aggressively because attention creates value wherever it lands. Attention influences memory. Attention influences behavior. Attention influences relationships. Attention influences meaning itself. Wherever attention settles, reality becomes more substantial. Wherever attention fragments, experience becomes thinner. That's why full attention is becoming increasingly expensive, not financially, psychologically. To give something your complete attention now requires rejecting countless alternatives. Every moment of focus is also a moment of exclusion. Every meaningful conversation excludes other conversations. Every shared experience excludes other signals. Every act of presence requires saying no to something else. The modern environment constantly increases the number of alternatives available. As alternatives multiply, concentration becomes more valuable. Not because attention changed, because scarcity became visible. The rarest resource in the room is no longer information. Information is everywhere. The rarest resource is a person who is fully here. Not partially here, not temporarily here, fully here. Undivided attention has become so uncommon that people immediately recognize it when they encounter it. It feels different, heavier, more real, more memorable. Almost like discovering something that used to be normal. I think that's why certain people leave such a strong impression on us. Sometimes it has very little to do with intelligence, status, or personality. They simply pay attention differently. When they are with you, they seem to remain in the same moment. No constant scanning, no visible competition, no sense that something else is waiting just beyond the edge of awareness. The experience feels unusual now. Not because presence became extraordinary, because distraction became ordinary. That's what makes modern disconnection so difficult to understand. The evidence appears to contradict the feeling. People remain reachable. Communication remains constant. The signal never stops moving. Messages arrive, calls connect, updates appear, reactions continue. From a technical perspective, the world has never been more connected. And yet many people describe the same experience. Something feels further away than it used to. The explanation is not hidden inside access. Access expanded dramatically. The explanation is hidden inside attention. Relationships do not experience availability the way systems do. They experience presence. A person can be available all day and still feel distant. A person can respond instantly and still feel absent. A person can remain connected to the network while gradually disconnecting from the moment. That's the distinction modern environments make difficult to see. Contact became abundant. Presence remained limited. Communication became easier. Attention became more contested. Connectivity increased. Arrival became less common. Nobody left. Nobody disappeared. Nobody abandoned the conversation. The structure surrounding the conversation changed. More signals entered the room. More alternatives entered awareness. More destinations competed for the same attention. Eventually, the experience of connection itself began to change. Not because relationships became less important, because attention became harder to hold in one place long enough for relationships to fully experience it. The world solved distance. The world did not solve division. And division is often what people are feeling when they struggle to explain why connection seems different now. I think that's why this feeling is so easy to doubt. Everything looks connected. The evidence is everywhere. Contacts, conversations, notifications, activity, availability. The network appears stronger than ever. Then, every once in a while, you encounter someone who is completely present. No visible competition, no divided attention, no sense of urgency pulling them elsewhere. And suddenly, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. You realize that what felt missing was never communication. It was arrival. Maybe the strangest part of all this is that the system succeeded. Distance became almost irrelevant. Information moves instantly. Communication never stops. Access became constant. Availability became normal. The barriers that separated people for centuries largely disappeared. From a technological perspective, the problem was solved. And yet, the feeling remained. Not because people became less connected, because connection and presence were never the same thing. The signal arrived. Attention became divided. Communication expanded. Presence became fragmented. The world learned how to keep everyone connected to everything. The unintended consequence was that attention became increasingly difficult to keep anywhere for long. That's why so many modern experiences feel incomplete without appearing broken. The contact exists. The activity exists. The communication exists. What often disappears is the feeling that someone has fully crossed the threshold into the same moment. The feeling that they arrived. Maybe that's what people are actually describing when they talk about disconnection. Not the absence of people, not the absence of communication, the absence of undivided presence, the absence of arrival. Because in a world where everyone is available, the rarest experience is no longer access. The rarest experience is finding someone who is completely here, including yourself. I think that's the part that stayed with me. Nobody left. Nobody disappeared. The network kept expanding. The signals kept moving. Everything continued working exactly as designed. And somehow the thing people value most in relationships became harder to find. Not because it vanished, because it became surrounded, buried beneath interruptions, alternatives, notifications, updates, and competing destinations for attention. Which means the question is no longer whether connection exists. The question is whether anyone is still arriving when it does. If you want to understand how this feels, Punchline Protocol explores the human experience behind it. If you want to understand how it works, that's what Darkside Protocol is for. And if you want to see what emerges when both perspectives meet, Debrief Protocol continues the conversation. 3 perspectives, 1 reality. The ideas are human. The narration is digital. Interpretation remains yours.